Okay, right. I believe the recording is now underway. So very good afternoon and thank you for joining us today for Business Research Methods lecture number 1. So research methods, what is it and why are we here? Well, for any subject, irrespective of whether it's social sciences here in the business faculty, whether it is applied sciences such as the likes of biology, chemistry, physics, whether it is law school, whether it is any other faculty at all, really, engineering, design. Research is important because it allows us to structure what we're trying to achieve, okay? Anybody could go out and claim that they've discovered something new. Anyone could go out and claim that they've uncovered something, but it's the process with which we uncover that new knowledge, or the process in which we demonstrate our critical understanding or analytical skills of understanding a phenomenon that makes it stand out, okay? So research is fundamental to what all universities and further research establishments do. It's what underpins the whole purpose of why the further education exists, okay? It's about giving a sense of purpose, giving a sense of what we're trying to do through the education sector. It's all about improving our knowledge, our understanding, and contributing to the future, okay? So let's now decode that. What do we mean by contributing and what do we mean by adding to knowledge? Well, for you and for the purposes of this module, there's a couple of key objectives that I want you to take away from today. Firstly, I want you to have the ability to formulate a better research question. Okay, so as I said already, anyone can carry out research. Research is not a difficult thing to do. What is difficult though is having a structure, having a process to what you're doing. So step 1 is to be able to formulate a research question that is very specific, very focused, has a narrow scope, okay? It's about being able to zone into something or one particular area or phenomenon that can then be investigated. I want you to feel more comfortable with the research process. So when you leave after the end of the second module, I want you to feel comfortable that you've understood what a research process is, why in academia we structure research studies in such a way, why do we follow this framework? So these are all things you should be able to understand by undertaking this module. I want you to understand the ideas of constructs and what we mean by operationalization of a research project. So again, constructs are part of how research is made up. They're like the building blocks, okay? So I will explain them in more detail as we get into that section, but it's the building blocks or the foundations of a research project. And operationalization is what it says on the tin. It is the way in which you turn a plan, the way in which you turn a blueprint into practice. So it's how do you go from planning your research to actually carrying out your research? That's the operationalization component. And finally, I want you to be able to understand the major differences between quantitative, qualitative, and other types of research, which we will discuss as we proceed with the lecture series. Okay, so I want you to be able to kind of understand the positivist, the interpretivist phenomenologies. I want you to have a better understanding of epistemology, philosophy stances. These are all things we'll cover off, not in a great level of detail because this is not quite going into level 9, but if you're in level 9, we'll be looking specifically at things like philosophy and epistemology in greater detail. But that being said, it's useful for you to have some kind of grounding and background, so I will be giving you some of that as well. So I'm going to start off with a quote from Albert Einstein. Now, I'm sure you all have heard or know who Albert Einstein is and what Albert Einstein does, or did, I should say, in the past tense. But he said, if we knew what we were doing, then it wouldn't be called research now, would it? Anyone want to share some thoughts on what you think Albert Einstein meant, or why when he said this quote, what was it Albert Einstein wanted to share with us? Anybody want to share some thoughts? No? Okay, well, I'll leave it now. I'm guessing you're all very shy at the start of the module, so I'll tell you this one, but hopefully there'll be more opportunities for you to interact. But essentially, Albert Einstein is talking about what real core research is. The reason we research something is because we don't actually know enough about that concept or that topic, okay, we know that people are talking about it. We maybe have seen some evidence of it in practice, but we don't know enough about that construct. We don't know enough about the phenomenon that we're trying to investigate. So if we already knew the answer, then why would we carry out a research project? That's what Albert Einstein's trying to say here. The whole purpose of research is to try and uncover the answer, to try and get from the unknown to a state of being in the known. So again, research is all about trying to provide answers. It's not about trying to guess what the answer is going to be and then working your way there. Anyone can do that as well. That's not what real research is. Real research is going in almost blind. It's about having a research question and saying, here's what I want to investigate. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but this is the process and the framework I'm going to follow so that I try and come up with an answer. And that in itself is what research is all about. So let's kind of deconstruct that further. Well, research in itself is an endeavour to discover answers to intellectual and practical problems through the application of a scientific method. So again, research methodology is a way in which we can provide, as I said already, a framework or a method to conducting a study. Okay, that's what it's all about. It's about giving it structure. It's about giving it an applied scientific method that will uncover more details for you. Okay, it's a systematized effort to gain new knowledge. So again, the idea of it being an intentional framework, an intentional design that is there to help us uncover new knowledge. We design research so that we can try and uncover something that is not known. That might sound like a paradox. How can you design something when you don't know the answer? Well, that's part of the problem with research, okay? When we are designing our research project, we don't really know where it's going to go. We might end up discovering things that are in line with perhaps the design, or sometimes we uncover things that we didn't anticipate. Sometimes we discover things that make us challenge our own assumptions, that make us challenge whether or not what we held or what we thought to be true about a particular subject is still true. So research is all about testing, trying, and getting some answer, which may or may not be the final stop. Okay, just because it applies in one context, just because it's been discovered in one area, doesn't mean that it can't be applied in other areas too. Okay, so research, a good definition perhaps, or a meaning for you to take away is research is a systematic process of collecting and analyzing information, which can also be called data, in order to increase our understanding of the phenomenon which we are concerned or interested in. So again, it's a process by which we collect and analyze information so that we can increase our understanding of that area and we can try and uncover some interesting facts, some interesting observations that may not otherwise be known. And that's basically the fundamental purpose of what research looks to do. So based on that definition, how can we understand what research is? Well, research is the process of finding solutions to a problem after a thorough study and analysis of the situational factors. So what are situational factors? Well, situational factors are those contextual elements. So for example, a particular geography, that's a contextual element. For example, a particular subset of people, whether you are looking at males, females, elderly, young children, whether you're looking at people who are employed, unemployed. So again, they all provide what we call situational factors that may be influencing our study. For example, if you were to be looking at house prices in particular areas, you will tend to find there's a strong correlation between people that are in employment or in well-paid employment and the types of houses or types of places in which they reside. Okay, so if you live in a nice area, if you live in an area with high house prices, the likelihood is that people living in those types of buildings or those houses will be from an affluent background, will have good jobs, will have well-paying jobs, okay? So some things there is a correlation for. And those are what we call situational factors. The likelihood of you finding someone unemployed on benefits from the government living in an affluent area is highly unlikely. Okay, so that's what we mean by situational factors. What are some of the situational contextual elements that are impacting what is happening, what might be influencing your research. Finally, the information provided could be the result of a careful analysis of data gathered, either firsthand or of data that's already available. So again, I'll cover this in more detail, but there can be two types of data or information that you can collect. There's primary information. That's when you physically go out and carry out data collection, and that can be in the form of interviews, that can be in the form of case studies, focus groups. There's lots of different ways in which you can conduct first-hand or primary data collection. It can even be stuff like your own notes and your observations as to what's going on. These are all primary observations, or these are all primary sources of data. However, there's also what's called secondary sources of data. Now, these are those data sets that are already published. So examples of that may be if you're investigating perhaps company annual reports. So company accounts are published in annual reports, and that's done on a yearly basis. So that's information or data that's already available, okay? That's not something you have to go and collect. All you have to do is do a quick search on the company corporate website, and you'll have access to their annual reports. Now, that's just one way in which we can understand secondary data. Secondary data can also be things like publications. So for example, you might be looking at research, what research has already been done, what are academics saying. So if you're looking at journals, you're looking at textbooks, that's published data, that's information already available. So that's a form of secondary data as well. So these are just some of the things for you to remember. Primary is your data collection, i.e. you go out and you ask questions, you go out, carry out surveys, you carry out focus groups. These are you physically going out and collecting data. Secondary is still you collecting data, but data is already available, okay? It's already out there for people to see and collect. Now, research provides the needed information that guides managers, it guides practitioners, it guides the government, so policymakers, to make informed decisions and to successfully deal with problems. So research isn't just for the academic community, okay? When we do research, we're not doing it simply so that it sits in a book in the library for people to read when they want to. The reason we do research is we want to try and influence the way in which people think about something, okay? If you're doing research on strategy, or you're doing research in management or HR or marketing, then the fundamental reason for you doing that is to try and shape how that practice unfolds. How does strategy get realized in practice? How is the marketing function evolving? How is HR learning from different people and applying different principles? It's all about understanding what we can add to what's already out there. If all you're going to do is do the exact same thing that somebody else has already done, then you're not actually contributing anything. Your research is almost worthless because it's already been conducted. I'll give you an example. Porter's 5 forces model. Now, Porter's 5 forces model is almost 40 years old, 1980s. Michael Porter came up with that model. And a lot of students have applied that model in lots of different contexts. If you were to just go and apply the model again today, in the exact same context someone's already done 10 years ago or 5 years ago, then you're probably not going to realize anything new. Now, yes, you could argue the economy's changed or things have happened, but the actual model that you're applying, unless you're critiquing that model and saying it's not relevant anymore, you're not actually doing anything to add new knowledge, okay? So just be careful when you are carrying out research. We're not looking for you to simply do what's already been done. We're looking for you to test that. Perhaps you've come across something and someone claims it to be something else. Again, you can test that. You can say, well, my research will look to test the findings of this author by applying it in the context of this industry or this particular area. So again, what you're doing is you're testing the knowledge that's there. You're trying to prove or disprove as to whether or not it holds true. Now, that's valid. That's a valid way for you to conduct your research, but it needs to be somewhat different to what's already been done. If you're just going to replicate, or if you're just going to plagiarize what's already been done, then that's not what research is. That's just you replicating a study. Research is when you go and try and add something new, okay? So why do we do research? What are the objectives of it? Well, the purpose of it is to discover answers through, as I said already, the application of a scientific procedure or a scientific process. Some of these objectives are to gain familiarity with a phenomenon or to achieve new insights. That can be through exploratory or formulative research. So again, for example, artificial intelligence or business intelligence through artificial intelligence technologies is quite new. It's something organizations are experimenting with. You might want to understand better how that's being done. That could be done through what we call an exploratory study. You're exploring how something comes together. You're exploring how something's being applied in practice. So that would be called an exploratory study. Or one of the objectives may be to portray accurately the characteristics of a particular individual, situation, or a group. And that's what we call descriptive research. Okay. Now, descriptive research is slightly different. Why? Because descriptive research is about you trying to understand how something happens. Now, for this, you usually want to investigate something that's well established or something that has now been applied fairly robustly in organization practice. So for example, if you were looking at online e-commerce, so online shopping, that's been around for 20 years. Okay, it's evolved, it's changed, there's been new ways in which you can interact with companies, but in the whole, the way in which you shop online is quite an established process now. So you could try to do a descriptive study to try and understand a particular phenomena, a particular group of people, how they use online shopping, how they interact with online brands, how they behave in certain contexts. These are all things you might want to investigate. So that's where you look at something that's fairly established and you try to describe, you try to explain what's going on. We have what's called determine the frequency with which something occurs, and that's diagnostic research. So it's usually looking at associations. You're trying to look whether or not something happens so many times. So for example, the London red buses, you could do a frequency study based on how many times a London red bus goes through a particular district or a particular borough of London. That would be what's called a frequency study, okay, or diagnostic research. It's about you trying to discover the frequency with which something occurs. You could perhaps measure the weather. You could be looking at rainfall in a particular month, and that's something that's published. You know, the Met Office in the UK, Meteorology Office, the people that deal with the weather, they're concerned with measuring stuff like average rainfall every month. They're concerned with measuring the wind speed. So these are all things that are measured and are done through what's called diagnostic research. It's by looking at the frequency, how often does something happen? And then finally, we have the objective to test a hypothesis. Now that's when you're trying to discover relationships. It's where you're trying to say, is X directly responsible for Y? Or does X impact Y? Or are X and Y completely separate? Okay, you're trying to understand whether there's a relationship between two or more variables. And that's called hypothesis testing. So for example, you could say that this is slightly ridiculous because it's probably not true. You could say that there's a correlation between the amount of time we spend outside and how clever we may be. Now, obviously, that's a ridiculous comparison, but the point I'm trying to make is it's about comparing it between two variables. You could look at how long someone, so you can set up two groups. You could have one group where you ask them to spend, I don't know, 5 hours a day outside doing things in the garden, doing things, you know, with their friends, whatever. Another group you could ask to stay inside and they can study or whatnot. And then you can compare the two groups. You can see, well, who is smarter, who is excelling at school, who is excelling at university. So again, these are all experiments that you can set up to test your hypothesis as to whether or not there's a direct correlation between people that are more sociable and the level of educational attainment. Okay, so that's just one such study. Another study you might want to conduct is, so for example, one of the things that we struggle with in the UK is the life of a car. So the life cycle of a car is very short in the UK. Some people argue it's because of the weather. It gets quite cold in the winter, quite rainy weather. Cars begin to erode. The rust on the car starts to eat away at the underneath the chassis of the car. So again, you could argue, is there a correlation between Sorry, someone's not on mute. Can I ask you to make sure you're on mute, please? Unless you have a question to ask, sorry, can you always please make sure you're on mute? Just makes it easier for everyone to follow the lecture. Sorry, what was I saying? Hypothesis testing, the situation with, for example, motor vehicles in the UK. It could be, for example, that you could look at a study between the weather forecast and the impact it has on the life cycle of a car. So you could do, for example, a 10-year study, and you can look at a car in the UK and how it's exposed to the weather versus a car in, for example, Dubai or the UAE, where it's much more hot, sunnier climates, and they don't have as much extreme weather conditions, particularly to do with rain, snow, and sleet, and things that would rust your car easily. So again, just looking at ways in which we can compare two variables, okay? That's what hypothesis testing is all about. So what are the characteristics of research? Well, there's a few different things. I'm not going to go through everything because I'm sure you're probably aware of some of these, or you've come across them, and they're in front of you anyway. So I'm sure you're all capable individuals and can read what's in front of you on the screen. But a couple of things that are useful to note. Research involves you gathering data, whether it's from primary or secondary sources, but doing it for a particular purpose, and that purpose needs to be different to any other purpose that's come beforehand, okay? So if all you're doing is gathering data to do the exact same thing someone else has already done, then you're not really doing research, you're just replicating someone else's work. You need to be gathering data. Now, it might be the same data that someone else has already used, so it could be secondary, someone's already collected it for you, but your purpose of analysing it should be different. You could be looking at something completely different. You could be looking at something unrelated. You could be looking at something that doesn't perhaps correlate directly with what was done beforehand. As long as the purpose for which you're conducting your research is different, then it's acceptable for you to do. Research requires what we call expertise. Now, obviously, there's some people that are better than others at doing research. Some people have a more natural tendency to understand and apply the fundamentals of research better than others. It's just a skill. In the same way that some people are better footballers, some people are better drivers, some people are better craftspeople, So it's in a similar vein, researchers are also a skill, they're also a trade. Some people are better at researching than others are, okay? It's just something that we need to accept. Now, research is and needs to be objective and logical. Now, this is very important. Why does it need to be objective? Because it's all about proving and disproving. It's all about cold, hard facts of what you're seeing and observing. If it was subjective, then that's based on your own opinion. That's based on what you think. But that's not what research should be. Research should be objective. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how can I carry out completely 100% objective research? And you'd be right in thinking, it's impossible, because it almost is. To a large degree, as the researcher, you are embedded within the research project. You're involved in the very essence of your research. So to a degree, there will be some subjectivity, but your job as a researcher is to try and mitigate the risks of that subjectivity taking over. You have to be objective. If you discover something or you find something that doesn't fit with your research question or perhaps opposes what you're finding, then your job or your responsibility as a researcher is not to ignore that, it's to embrace it. It's to bring it on board and say, okay, well, why did that happen? What was the specific scenario? What was the situational factor? What was the context that impacted what I was finding? Okay, so it needs to be objective. It needs to be cold, hard facts. Whether they prove what you're trying to say or disprove, that doesn't matter. Research isn't about being right. Research is about proving something through a logical process. I think the rest of them are fairly obvious. So as I said already, it's all about you capturing accurate observations and descriptions. You shouldn't be making things up. You shouldn't be making up facts and figures. You should be using the data that you either see or hear from other people if you're doing interviews, etc. Okay, your data needs to be held true. There's a question that's come in from the chat, and I think it's a very good question. Someone's asking, is it the same approach that can be used across all academic research? Now, that's a very, very good question. Certainly in social sciences, which is our domain, so business studies fall into social sciences, this approach holds true 99% of the time, okay? So following a set rigorous research framework is important for all social science subjects. So what we're going through today, you could use this whether or not you're studying business, whether or not you're studying humanities, social sciences. All these subjects are vaguely similar in their philosophical positioning. However, some subjects aren't, okay? So subjects such as sciences, applied sciences, so where you do medical experiments, subjects such as even law to a large degree is slightly different. Stuff like engineering, design, manufacturing, these subjects have different processes. A lot of them are a lot more technical. We deal with philosophical assumptions. We deal with the purpose of the body of knowledge and how we contribute to it. Whereas these applied subjects such as design, manufacture, biomedical sciences, they're dealing with slightly different things, okay? The way in which they conduct their research is a lot more experimental. They don't have the same constraints that we have in social sciences in terms of how we ground and frame our research. So that's a good question. Thank you, Romano. Okay, so that's the characteristics of research. What's important is we follow what's called a scientific method. Now, I don't want to get confused here. When I say science or scientific method, I'm not referring to physics or chemistry or biology, okay? That's not the purpose of what I'm saying. When I'm talking about scientific method, I'm talking about using a systematic process. It's about you organizing the knowledge, you organizing the information that you've collected and making use of this processual or process-based approach to carrying out research, okay? So when you're doing your study, you need to have a structure in place. Firstly, so that you know what you're doing, so it keeps you on the straight path. You know what's next, you know what to approach, what to do. Secondly, it's for transparency. Because of the nature of social sciences research and the ability for us to easily fall into a trap of subjectivity, in order to be objective, we should always document what we're going to do and what we did, what we found. Why? It gives you an audit trail. So when you do present your research or when you do submit your research, you want to be able to show to your examiner what you did, how you did it, what you found, okay? These are all fundamental components of a scientific research project. Now, the scientific method is a systematic collection of data, or in other words, facts, okay? Primary and secondary data is factual information to a large degree, and their theoretical treatment through proper observation, perhaps experimentation, but particularly interpretation. So it's how you take the data that you have through that process of observing it, understanding it, perhaps experimenting with it. So, you know, if you're doing a relationship between two or more variables, you might want to experiment with it. What you really want to do is look at the relationship between those variables. How do they or do they not come together? That's experimentation. And then you interpret it. That's down to your analytical skills. How well can you analyze, whether it's discursive, whether it's critical, or whether it's just solely analytical? How do you understand what's there? How do you interpret or make sense, deconstruct the data that's in front of you? So a scientific method attempts to achieve the systematic interrelation of facts by experimenting, by observing, and through logical arguments. Now, the three of these are quite important, okay? It's about experimenting with the data that you have. You're not going to get it right first time. You might do. I'm not going to say you can. It's not impossible. But the likelihood is the way in which you interpret data will evolve. Okay, you'll get better at it. The more you do it, the more practice you have, the better you'll become at being objective. The first thing that I always find students struggle with, and I myself struggled with when I first started, was how to be objective. We're human beings. We have we have cognitive functions. We have personal associations with certain things, personal understandings. The way in which I see the world around me is different, perhaps, in the way in which you see the world around you. Now, when I go to analyze something or interpret something, I'm doing it with that lens, okay? And that lens is the way in which I see the world. Similarly, when you go to analyze something, without even thinking about it, subconsciously, you will be drawing conclusions, you will be making assumptions about something because of the way in which you're programmed. Now, that's not a bad thing. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what makes us unique. That's what makes us human beings, the ability to do that. However, in research, we want to be as objective as possible. So sometimes it's about going over that piece of data 2, 3, 4, 5 times to see, is there anything I've missed? Is there anything I'm looking at that I've not perhaps explored from a different angle? Have I not maybe looked at from a different perspective? And that's when you know that you're being objective, because you're able to critique your own approach. You're able to analyze what you're doing, and you're able to draw criticisms almost of your own way of understanding. And that's what we call objective research, okay? So it's about that constant experimenting with the data. Any questions on the scientific method? Is that clear to everyone? Because it can be quite difficult to get your head around, but really it's about saying, how can we be objective? How can we strip out any bias, any subjectivity? And how can we ensure that the argument we're presenting or the discussion that we're presenting is logical? It makes sense. You know, there's a logic to what we're saying. That's what the scientific method is all about. I'll take the silence to mean that no one has a question, everyone's happy with the scientific method, so I'll just move on. So basic postulates in scientific method. So there's a couple of postulations that I want you to take away from this. Oh, sorry, I've gone too far ahead. So firstly, it relies on what we call empirical evidence. For any research project, you need to have empirical evidence. What's empirical evidence? Well, it can be something like a case study, where you perhaps investigate a group of people, an organization, you investigate a way of working, you investigate, so a case study is something that you're exploring. So that's empirical investigation. It can be primary, so you can go out and do it yourself, or it can be secondary, so you can collect data that's already published. But it needs to be some kind of empirical investigation. It's not a case of you just guessing or making assumptions or theorizing. It's about you actually looking at either existing data, or you going to collect data and then coming up with your own conclusions from that. It's about utilizing relevant concepts. So it's about taking what we do know, what we don't know, and combining it, okay? So what are the building blocks of what we're seeing? What do we know already? What's already been published in this area? What's perhaps become knowledge or common knowledge but isn't tested yet? What perhaps do we not know about this? These are the things that you want to play with, okay? These are concepts that you will come across when you're doing research. And what you want to be able to do is try and understand what's the relationship between those. What am I seeing? What am I observing? What am I hearing from my interview participants? What is that? What does that mean for for not just the understanding, but the way in which we construct understanding of a particular phenomenon? It's about committing to only objective considerations. So again, I've talked about objectivity quite a lot, so I'm not going to mention anything more, but as I said already, it's about avoiding subjectivity. It's about presupposing ethical neutrality. Now, this is a particularly difficult area. Depending on what research you're doing, ethical neutrality can be very, very difficult to achieve, mostly because, as I've said already, we are human beings. We have a certain cultural background, upbringing that influences how we behave, how we understand what is right, what is wrong. So I'll give you an example. When I was studying at university, one of the students, or one of the PGR researchers that I knew, was looking at the prostitution industry in Scotland. Now, obviously, there's an ethical boundary as to what you can and can't do when you're dealing with people, particularly when the area he was exploring was not a legal industry. Prostitution in the UK is illegal. So again, there's a lot of ethical and moral barriers there. So he had to go through a lot of ethical approval from the university before he could carry out that research. So sometimes ethical neutrality is quite important. You could be asked, so for example, say you start working for a research think tank or you start working for a research institution, you could be asked to go and investigate anything. You could be looking at child poverty. You could be looking at mortality rates. You could be dealing with stuff like infant mortality. So again, sometimes you come across subjects that are emotionally difficult for you to properly immerse yourself into. That's where the idea of ethic neutrality is important, because you need to be able to detach your own emotions, your own ethical perspectives, put them to one side and try to be completely objective, okay? Similarly, I knew someone that was looking at inmates in prison, trying to understand cognitively, psychologically, how they behaved, whether or not they were truly repenting for their crimes. Now, that person had to go through a lot of vetting and security and ethical clearance, because obviously they are going into a dangerous situation in a jail. But most importantly, they were dealing with people that were murderers, rapists. Some of these people had committed some seriously horrendous crimes. And already, when you hear about people like that, you start to form a judgment about them. You start to make assumptions about them, how they must behave, how they must be like. So again, you need to be able to try and detach yourself from that. It's not easy, okay? It's not easy to do that. But good, solid, objective research requires that we detach our feelings, our thoughts, our own opinions, and actually follow what the facts are, okay? Follow the data, follow the cold, hard numbers, cold, hard information that we've collected. It results into probabilistic predictions, and this is quite important, okay? We generally, and you could have the smartest person in the world sitting here, generally speaking, when we come up with findings and conclusions in our research, we can't say that they are the right answer or they are 100% the only answer, because it's all about probability, okay? This is where your situational factors come into play. When you go and research something, there'll be certain contexts, certain situations that are influencing your research that you might not even be aware of. For example, today in this world, we're recovering from, the COVID pandemic. The economy is very different to what it would have been had there been no COVID. People in particular parts of the world are struggling from different things. If you're doing a study in Afghanistan right now, for example, the Taliban rule, and people are scared for their lives at the moment in some places in Afghanistan. So again, there are certain contextual situational factors that are impacting or influencing your study. Now, obviously, these are things that are obvious, and I'm sure you'll be aware of them, but the point I'm trying to make is there'll be things that are going on that will impact your study. So when you collect that data is based on not only what you hear and see, but also on the people that you're talking to, their experiences. They might give you a certain answer. How do you know that that answer is completely true? They could be lying to you. There's no way for you to necessarily prove, unless you do multiple studies with multiple people, but that can take a long time. But if you're doing, for example, a random study of 50 people, those 50 people are mostly unrelated. They could tell you absolutely anything. You would just have to assume it's true based on what they're telling you. So again, it's about the probability that what you discovered is true. And I'm not saying people are liars. Most people will tell you the truth, but realistically, you have to be careful and say, this is based on what you're hearing and seeing. It's not necessarily based on an objective truth. It's based on an interpretation of the truth. The methodology is made known. So this is quite important. This is why we have research methods in the first place. It's important that you make it clear what your research methodology is going to be. If anyone on the call has read any academic journals or papers, you'll come across a section called research methodology. Usually it comes after the literature review. So usually you have an introduction, you have a literature review, and then you have what's called a research methodology. Sometimes it's only a couple of paragraphs, sometimes it's a couple of pages, depends on the nature of the project or the research that you're reading. But the fundamental purpose of that chapter or that section is to give you, the reader, insight into how the study was conducted. What did that person do? How did he or she look at that area? How did he or she attempt to investigate what was happening? Because that's important. The way in which they did their study will also influence what the outcome is. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, you and I could both be looking at the exact same thing. So for example, say we are looking at the correlation between affluence, so people that are well off, and where they live in the country. So again, you'd expect to find people that are affluent living in perhaps the more affluent areas or areas that have, expensive properties. Now you could do what's called a quantitative study. So you could do surveys, you could do statistics, frequency, you could look to, capture numerical data. I could go and do a qualitative study. I could go do interviews. I could start interviewing people that live in these houses and understand from them what they're saying, what they're telling me about their lives. So that's two completely different ways in which we can investigate the exact same thing. You're doing surveys and frequency distribution. You're looking at numbers. You're trying to add up how many people, how much salary, how much is the house worth. You're looking at what we would call statistics. Whereas I'm looking at people's stories, I'm looking at what they're telling me, I'm interviewing them, I'm listening to them, I'm listening to them telling me, what they've achieved, where they live, how they've gone about their business to get to where they are today. So what we find might actually be slightly different because I'm looking at someone's own account, someone's interpretation of where they are. Whereas you're looking at the cold hard numbers, you're looking at statistics, you're looking at figures. So this is why methodology is important. We both would say we're looking at the exact same thing. Okay, we're both looking at the relationship between affluence and where people live, but the way in which we're doing it is very, very different. And the findings will therefore also be slightly different. They won't be miles apart, they probably will be quite similar, but there will be some degree of difference in how we present our findings. And that's why it's so important that we make it clear what the methodology is from the very beginning. The aim of research is to formulate scientific theories, okay? Now, obviously, at this level, I don't expect you to come up with new theories, and no one would expect you to do that, but it's a way in which we try to then say, well, this is the existing bank of knowledge, this is the existing theories that are already in place. What does recent research tell us about them? Do they still hold true? Is there new theories that need to be created that better explain what's happening? That's the whole purpose of research, okay? So what makes good research? Well, there's a couple of things that are important. Firstly, the purpose needs to be clearly defined. So I've already talked to you about the purpose. You need to make it clear what your research is looking to achieve. It needs to be quite focused, it needs to be a narrow scope. Your research process has to be detailed. So again, you need to make it clear to me or whoever's reading your research what the method is, what you're doing. It needs to be thoroughly planned. So you need to be able to go into a research knowing how you're going to do something. So what am I going to do? I am going to carry out this investigation. How am I going to do it? Well, I'm going to use primary data because I'll be interviewing, I'll be doing case studies of an organization. I will then be analyzing the data using a particular tool or a particular. So again, it's about setting up a plan, a blueprint for how you're going to tackle your research. You need to make sure that you're applying high ethical standards. So again, this is where it's important that you're detaching your subjective self from your objective self. When it comes to research, you almost have to leave your feelings, your emotions, your personal perspectives at the door, okay? We all hold views. We all have particular affiliations as things that we believe to be true or not true. They have to be left behind when we're researching. We have to be completely objective. We have to let the data speak for itself. We don't construe the data to mean something based on our own perceptions. We have to make sure we outline the limitations. So again, our research won't be perfect, and that's absolutely fine, okay? It's not anticipated that our research is going to be 100% perfect. We've covered every single box. You know, we've done this perfectly. There's no limitations. Everything's correct. That's not usually reflective of how research works. When I come across a paper, either written by a senior academic or by a junior student, and they say they haven't got any limitations, I'm very, very skeptical about that paper. Why? Because every research will have limitations. That limitation could be on time, it could be on access to data, it could be on many different things, but there will be some limitations to what you can and cannot achieve. And you need to be honest about them. You need to make them clear to your reader. He or she needs to know what the limitations of your study are. And if you don't do that, then you will not get accurate, you will not get fair reflective marks of your effort. Your findings need to be presented unambiguously. So again, when you're presenting your finding, they should be objective. They should prove or disprove. They shouldn't sit on the fence. Your findings should either say, yes, here's the evidence to back what I found, or here is the evidence to disprove. Okay, your findings need to be clear cut. Your conclusions have to be justified. So when you're drawing your conclusions, they should make sense. They should relate to what you found. They should relate to what you did. Sometimes you come across a paper, and what we academics will do usually is we'll read the abstract and then we'll jump straight to the conclusion. Why do we do that? Because we want to make sure that what you said you're going to do in the abstract and introduction is exactly what you did. The number of times you come across a paper where the conclusion is different to what the introduction is, you just realize that the study's not been well thought through. Okay, so make sure that your conclusion is justified. It represents what you're trying to do. And finally, your own experience should be reflected in that. So although I've said you shouldn't be subjective, you should be completely objective, it's useful sometimes to have what's called a reflection chapter at the end of your research project that reflects on your experience as a researcher. Okay, that's useful because it gives your reader an understanding of the process that you went through. It gives the reader an understanding of some of the struggles or tensions that you might have faced when trying to analyze, when trying to deconstruct. It's not easy. Okay, even in doing a PhD, I had a number of limitations and a number of reflections, a number of issues or tensions that I came across. So for anyone to say to me that there are no limitations, there are no tensions, it either suggests they've done a really bad job of their research, they don't even know them themselves what limitations are, or you know, they've just not understood the situation properly. There's always going to be something. There's always going to be something for you to pick up, acknowledge, and perhaps make better if you were to ever do it again. So reflections can be good in a good research project. This is just a summary of what we talked about. The only thing that's maybe new is replicability. So what do you mean by that? Your research needs to be replicable. That means once you've done it, I should be able to take what you've done and do it again by myself, and I should get, broadly speaking, the same findings. That's why it's important you list to me your research method. How did you do it? Because I want to be able to replicate it. And when I do replicate it, I should be finding 90% or 95% of the same answers as you. So replication is very, very important. So why do we do research? Well, as we said already, it's about exploring a subject. So, you know, explorative or formulative research. It's about describing, so descriptive research. It's about diagnosing or diagnostic research. It's about hypothesizing. And finally, it's about coming up with what we call inductions and deductions. So inductions are when you take something and you start to build knowledge from it. Okay, you start to say, well, I found this, this, and this. Here's how it comes together. You're building an argument. You're starting to build a pyramid almost. Okay, you've got the foundation. You found some data. You're analyzing it. You're understanding it. You're making sense of it. You're building a pyramid. You're building the knowledge blocks. Or deduction. Deduction is where you start from the top of the pyramid. Okay, so you've got usually a hypothesis. Okay, this is when something that's being tested, and then breaking it down, you're saying, here is what we think is true, or here's what, you know, we might expect to find. Here's what we actually found. Then you break it down. What's the process that was undertaken to get to that top of that pyramid, either to prove or disprove what's there. The scope and the significance of research. So research is done for decision-making purposes, both internal to an organization, but also for policy making, for academia. The reason we carry out research is to aid our decision-making, is to help us make better decisions about research, about public policy, about organizational practice. All of these things are impacted by research. It helps throw lights on risks and uncertainties. So again, there's a lot of things that we just don't know. Okay, we don't know how something's going to react, how it's going to behave. There's a lot of uncertainties, a lot of risks that we take on, both in organizations and also in government policy and also in universities and research centers. So the whole reason of us doing research is try and mitigate some of those risks. We want to reduce those risks. Research helps us understand what some of those uncertainties are. It allows us to identify an alternative course of action. So it's about saying, here's how we're doing it at the moment, but research gives us other opportunities. Research gives us a chance to explore how things might be done differently, how they might be done separately. It helps in the economic use of resources. So it allows organizations, it allows governments to understand where to focus their resource. Where should they be spending their money? Where is the best use of public funds? Where is the best use of shareholder money? And it helps in project identification. It allows us to prioritize. A number of times an organization will have a number of strategic options. They'll want to research firstly. They want to understand which is the best option for them. They want to see, who's the best contractor, who's the best bidder for this piece of work. And they'll do that by carrying out research. Okay, I'm going to stop there because it's been an hour of me talking. I'm going to take a short break. So let's aim to be back by 6:10 p.m. if that's okay. So that gives you a 12-minute break. Let's aim to be back by 6:10 p.m. UK time. Okay, thank you. Where we were and what we're looking at. So what is the scope or the significance of conducting a research project? Well, there's a couple of things. We said already it's helps decision making. We talked about throwing light on risks and uncertainties, identifying alternative courses of action. So again, it's about saying, what do we not know? How can we perhaps interpret or understand something that we couldn't do previously or we didn't know how to do previously? And economic resources. So from the government perspective, how can they best spend taxpayers' money? How can they best spend the money that the government has on different various projects in the economy? And similar with organizations, how can they best select from a range of different options? Research is the answer to all of those questions. Again, just continuing on the same vein, what does research also allow us to do? Helps us solve investment problems, pricing problems, allocation of resource problems. It helps us solve decision makings in human resources, and it solves various operational and planning problems associated with business and industry. It provides the basis for all government policies in our economic system. It helps social scientists in studying social relationships and in seeking answers to various social problems. For students, people like you guys, it's a means of careerism. Okay, so it's a way in which for you to establish a foothold and try to work your way up the social structure. So again, the reason for us pursuing further education is to better our opportunities to climb the corporate ladder, to try and achieve better than what we otherwise could if we didn't attend further education. So again, thinking about how research enables you to pick up the skills that can then be used in your jobs, can be used in your future employment opportunities, and build knowledge and skills that can deliver you the career that you want. Finally, for professionals in research, it's a means of a livelihood. There's people that do this for a living, okay? There's people that are recruited and paid to carry out research. So, they wouldn't be in a job if they didn't know how to do research. So again, it can be a livelihood. It can be a way of actually making money conducting research. And then for philosophers and thinkers, research means an outlet for new ideas and insights. In the social sciences domain, that's mostly what we are, okay? We are looking at the philosophical side of things. We're looking at the way in which we can generate new ideas and new insights into how things are done. For literary men and women, research means the development of new styles and creative work. So again, it's a way in which we can then try to imagine a better future. It's a way in which we can shape the future to be different. And finally, for an analyst or an intellectual, research means coming up with new theories. So it's about new ways in which we generate the understanding that we have. Okay. So that's the purpose of research, and that's how it's used by different stakeholders in the context of research development. However, it's not always good. There's always issues, as with anything. Research also encounters problems or complications when you are trying to complete it. One of the fundamental ones probably is the idea that it's not similar to real science. Okay, so when the question was asked earlier, does this apply to all academic research? I said the answer was no, and the reason it's no is because applied sciences, so this is things like, as I said already, engineering, manufacturing, design, biological sciences, for example, these are all things that require experimentation. They require practical and technical expertise. In the business world or in the social sciences world, or what we belong to, we don't really need to have any kind of technical knowledge. Okay, we are more here to generalize. We're more here to understand how things come together. We're here to almost theorize. You know, we can't really quantify what we're doing in the same way that an engineer might, in the same way that someone that's designing or manufacturing something would be able to do. So it's not actually the same at all when it comes to applied sciences versus what we call the social sciences. We have what are called uncontrollable variables. So there's going to be things that impact what we do that perhaps don't impact other research areas. Why? Because there are certain things that are outside of our control. For example, COVID. So COVID-19 brought the whole world to a standstill. And to be honest, it actually affected some applied sciences as well. But imagine you are an engineer or a design engineer looking to come up with a new way of constructing something, okay? COVID happening doesn't change your project. You're still trying to come up with a new way of constructing something, you know, whether you're prototyping, whether you're using tools or computer-aided manufacturer, you can still do what you're doing to a large degree. You're a business researcher, the organization you're researching may have closed its doors. The access that you previously negotiated to a case study company is now gone. The company may be gone bust. So COVID-19 fundamentally changed, for example, the structure of a lot of people's research designs. Why? Well, it's uncontrollable. No one can control COVID-19. No one can control the effects that it had. If you were doing a research study and you were trying to interview people and you set up interviews for April 2020, well, guess what? The whole world's in lockdown at the end of March. So April 2020 would have been a bad time for you to be doing research. Okay, so there's certain things that can happen that are uncontrollable, and you just have to accept them. You just have to try and find a way to overcome these complications. Human tendencies. Now, again, as I've said already, being objective is innately difficult, okay? Just trying to detach your subjective self and embrace your objective self is very, very difficult. Because, as I said already, we're programmed, we're human beings, we're trained, we're culturally inaugurated in such a way that we understand the world through a particular lens. To try and take that lens off, or to try and remove the rose-tinted glasses, as some people would call them, can be a painful and sometimes impossible exercise. Okay, it's not easy to leave behind everything you believe in, everything you hold true, everything that you thought you knew about the world, and then try and understand it again through an objective approach. That's difficult to do, and that's something that research requires us. Time and money. So again, you might have the best project idea in the world, but do you have the resources to carry that out? Okay, I'll give you an example. Somebody wanted to study, I think it was something to do with the emergence of the Middle East as a powerhouse, essentially. So how, countries like countries like UAE, Oman, Qatar are now trying to drive away from their oil history in terms of oil being their primary source of national income to stuff like tourism and the services sector. So an interesting project and certainly one that merited, investigation. However, that would involve that person having to go to Dubai. He would need money to go live in Dubai. It would also require, certain access to certain leaders in UAE and the government or the sheikh and his parliament. Again, very, very difficult to negotiate. So it just wasn't feasible. We didn't have the time or the resources to be able to carry out that project. So again, that was a problem. Really good idea, what he wanted to do, but he just didn't have the resources and the capabilities to be able to carry it through. Lack of computerization. Now, this is a little bit outdated, I would argue. I mean, in today's day and age, even at home, you can access basic computerization that allows you to construct your thinking. So, I mean, yes and no here, really. I can understand why lack of computerization might be an issue, but unless you're looking at really technical things, for a basic business research, you should be fine with a normal laptop, access to the internet, Microsoft Word. You might want to use MS Project or something to help you structure your research, but overall, there's no real concern and no real issue for you in conducting your research project. And finally, lack of scientific training in the methodology of research. Now, this is important. This is why you're all here today. You're here to get training. You're here to understand how to carry out a research project. Unfortunately, not everyone has the opportunity, and that can be a problem. There's people that are doing research without the requisite knowledge, the requisite understanding, the requisite comprehension of what research methods is and why it's important. Again, another couple of reasons. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just things that, it might impact the quality of a piece of research, whether or not the researcher has undertaken sufficient precautions to prevent this impact in the research is a genuine question that we would be asking as people that mark research, people that look through research. These are the kinds of things that we'd like to look out for to see, has this person overcome some of these issues? Ignorance is quite an important one, and it's one I'm not saying that people intentionally become ignorant. Obviously, they don't, or at least I'd like to think they don't. Ignorance is when you ignore the impact of certain things. So for example, I was saying earlier on that I've read research projects where they claim there were no limitations to the study. That for me is ignorance. There's always going to be some kind of research limitation, whether that limitation is to do with time, whether it's to do with money, whether it's to do with access, whether it's to do with the way in which the research was carried out, the skill set of the researcher. There's always going to be limitations. So when someone claims that they don't have limitations, for me, that's them being very ignorant. Okay, so that's what I mean by ignorance, where you just are blindsided to or completely oblivious to fundamental reasons as to why your research is important. The role of research in decision making. So this is quite important as well. So we said already, decision making is a process of selecting the best alternatives from the available set of options or alternatives. Management is chiefly concerned with decision making, as we know. These decisions should always be based on appropriate studies, evaluations, and observations. So again, in order for a manager to carry out his or her job effectively and make the right decision, he or she needs to have access to the requisite knowledge, to the requisite experience, to the requisite information. And that can only be done through effective and skillful research. According to Herbert A. Simon, decision-making involves three activities. These are the intelligence activities. This is when you do what we would call in research a literature review. Okay, you scan the environment, you're trying to identify the conditions necessary for a decision to be made. There's the designing activity. This is where you identify, develop, and analyze the courses of action. So this is your analysis. And then finally, your choice activity. This is where you choose the best course of action. Again, this is your conclusions. This is your justification. So that's how research can be mapped across into the real world. Factors that affect managerial decisions. So again, if you're doing a piece of research for your employer at work, or you're doing a piece of research for the government even, there's going to be things that are going to impact the quality of what you've done. Firstly, it's going to be internal factors. You know, there'll be certain things that prohibit a country, certain things that prohibit a company, such as the resources they have available, the technology that they have at their disposal, things like cash flow, things like manpower, how much resource can they give you or allocate to you for your project. The stuff like external factors, such as government policy. So if you're an organization, how does the government impact what you're doing? Things like socioeconomic factors. So again, if you're doing a research project in a place like Afghanistan right now versus a research project in a country like the USA or the UK, very, very different socioeconomic and geopolitical factors at play. And finally, quantitative factors, factors that can be measured in quantities such as time, resources, cost, etc., etc. So there's things that will influence or affect the quality of managerial decision making as well as decision making that we do. What about types of research? So here's when we go into the different nature of research. So we talked already about descriptive, it being all about describing the characteristics of an individual, a situation, or a group, understanding and explaining the current state of affairs. Okay, that's what description is all about. Can you give me a thorough description of what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're observing? But then there's what's called analytical research, and analytical is concerned with what predominantly we do with testing hypotheses. Okay, it's about testing something, it's about proving or disproving something. It's about specifying and interpreting the relationships by analyzing the facts or the information that is already available to you. We also have applied or fundamental research. So applied research, or action research as it's sometimes called in textbooks, is all about finding a solution to a real life problem. Okay, it's about applying yourself in the field. So action research, the researcher will probably go out and maybe carry out focus groups. He or she will be involved in the process of generating information. He or she will be responsible for carrying out, detailed interviews, detailed focus groups, ways in which they're actually directly involved. So that's action research. Or fundamental research, or what we sometimes call basic or pure research, is usually undertaken for the sole purpose of adding to knowledge. Now, that very rarely is the case, unless you're perhaps doing a PhD or you're studying for a qualification. 9 times out of 10, if you're doing a research project for a company, for the government, for anyone at all, you're doing it with a specific purpose in mind. I mean, that research will be used for something at some point. So it's quite important, that you have some structure to it. But fundamental research usually is just done through intellectual curiosity. You might be bored, which is very unlikely, but you could be bored and think to yourself, well, this is interesting. I'm going to go and spend the next 7 years of my life trying to investigate this. I'm taking the mic here, by the way. I'm not saying it would take 7 years, but the point I'm trying to make is fundamental research, or what we call basic or pure research, is that research that's taken or undertaken for the sole purpose of generating knowledge. Okay, there's no other reason for you to do that research. It's not for a company, it's not for the government, it's not for a particular person. It's just you wanting to do it to better your understanding. Qualitative and quantitative, and these are the big ones. These are the ones I'm sure you're all aware of as well, that you've heard in some context before. So quantitative is usually employed for measuring stuff like quantity, amounts, frequency, particularly where we use statistical analysis, okay? This is where you can do stuff like regressions, you can do stuff like finding the R value, you can do a number of different things, where it's basically about a statistical study of a data set. Qualitative research, meanwhile, is basically non-quantitative, is the best way to describe it sometimes. It's basically trying to understand a particular phenomena, usually things that are more complicated, because you usually can't get numbers or figures to do with complicated data. So you will end up interviewing people to collect data. So that's quite important. It's something to bear in mind. Conceptual versus empirical. So empirical, as we've said already, is about you using your experience or observations to come up with conclusions with regards to systems and theory. So it's about you using what's either already published or you going out there and collecting data, so carrying out primary research to generate findings, generate theories, generate conclusions. Conceptual research, meanwhile, is all about thinking. It's all about philosophy. It's about how do we understand something from a conceptual viewpoint? How can we construct a particular phenomena using models, using ways in which we understand it? Conceptual research, I'll be honest, is very, very rarely conducted outside of academia. So unless you're doing a research project for university or you're doing a project for school, realistically, you will always be dealing with empirical. Businesses are concerned with real life, they're concerned with empirical data. Similarly with governments, they're concerned with real data. They want to know about the economy, they want to know about people's socio-economic welfare. They don't really care about the conceptual side of things. So philosophy is, generally speaking, the domain of education, and particularly academic education. Some other types of research that you may come across. One-time research is basically where research is confined to a single time period. Okay, so it's only done for a particular purpose at a particular point in time. For example, research on COVID-19, something that was done at the time can only have been done at the time, okay? Things have changed since then. COVID has matured, the virus has become different, it's mutated. People have now been vaccinated, so they've got protection against the virus. Things have changed. So if you were looking at the impact of a brand new virus on people that were not inoculated or not vaccinated against the virus, you had a very specific window, you had a very specific time frame. So that would be very much a one-time research. I couldn't replicate that research today. If someone had done a study at that time and published it today, I couldn't try to replicate it because I wouldn't have the same access. Longitudinal research is usually research carried over a longer period of time. In terms of business studies, you tend to find that with, for example, change management projects. So say an organization is undertaking a change management program. As a researcher, you might want to understand, what's their rationale for doing it. So this is before this change is done, why they're doing it, what they're doing, how they're making decisions. Then you might want to come in halfway through and see the implementation. So it's being implemented, how does it look on the ground? Who the change managers, how they're dealing with people, how they're dealing with new systems, new processes. And then you might want to come back at the very end, maybe 3-4 years down the line, once everything's implemented, people are using the systems, people are using the new processes. That's what's called a longitudinal study. You try to get a bigger picture, a fuller picture of how something's done. And that can stretch over a period of usually years, sometimes even longer, decades, depending on what you're studying. Diagnostic research we talked about already, so it's mainly clinical research. It's all about identifying the cause of a problem and the frequency with which it occurs, and potentially any solutions. And finally, exploratory research, which is predominantly dealing with the preliminary study of an unfamiliar problem with which the researcher has little or no knowledge. Okay. Experimental research, it's all about experiments. And historical research is all about using secondary data, okay, so the past records that are available through the government, records that are available, perhaps company data, so annual reports, for example. These are all things that are historical. It's all about secondary data. Right, we're now going to move into the operationalization part. So how do you operationalize your research? How do you bring it to life? So the research process, it starts off with you defining the research problem. So this is where you try to come up with your research question. So you deconstruct what's been done already, or you deconstruct what's known and come up with your way of researching. We have to review concepts and theories, and we have to review research findings. So that's the first thing we will have to do. So what's already out there? What do we know about this topic? What's been written already? Once we've done that, we then formulate our hypothesis or formulate our research question. So we've understood what information is already out there. We had a broad research area that we wanted to investigate. How do we now turn that into a specific, narrow, focused research question? Okay, now that part's important. The idea of it being narrow and focused scope. The reason for that is, with research, it's very easy to sometimes fall into the trap of doing something way too vague or way too big, because you can't investigate that, okay? For example, if you said to me you wanted to investigate the impact of COVID-19 on the medical industry, that is massive, okay? There's so many things you could look at. You could look at, hospitals, you could look at doctors, general surgeries, you could look at medical practices, you could look at, even stuff like dental. There's so many different areas you could be investigating, so you need to be very, very focused. Whereas if you said to me, you want to investigate the impact of COVID-19 on the mortality rate in accident and emergency departments and hospitals, that's very specific, okay? You want to look at how COVID-19 corresponds with higher death rates in accident and emergency departments. So again, it's very clear to me where you're investigating, what you're investigating, and it gives you structure for your project, okay? So it's quite important for you to be quite focused, quite narrow with your scope. Then we move into the stuff that's in the red. I've put it in the red on purpose because this is the bit that's all about bringing it to life. This is where you design the research, okay? This is where you include the sample design. This is where you start to bring it to life. You've now got your research question. You've read some of the research that's already been done in your area, and you're now starting to understand how you're going to bring your research to life. What are the tools and techniques you're going to use to conduct your research? You then go and collect your data. So this is you executing your research, okay? This is you going out there and collecting your data. Once you've got it, you're then analyzing your data, okay? So you've now collected all this information. You've got to try and analyze it. You've got to try and make sense of it. You've got to deconstruct what people have said, what you've collected, and try and see if there's any patterns, any links, any themes that are emerging in what you found. And once you've done that, it's all about interpreting it and reporting it, okay? So it's about taking what you've analyzed, what you've deconstructed, and almost putting it back together again into an argument, a succinct argument that's logical, that's objective, that shows that you've understood what's happening. And that in itself is a research process, okay? So if anyone asks me or anyone says to me, what is research or what's a research process? Well, this is basically what you do, okay? You start with a broad problem. You read around the subject, try to understand what people are saying about the subject. Once you've kind of done some high-level sufficient reading, you then move into the formulation stage where you come up with your specific research question. So here's what other people have done, here's what they're saying, here's what is important to them. But why is it important to me? What do I want to find? What's my research question? And once you've done all that, you're then executing it, okay? You're bringing your research to life. And that's where we're going to focus our attention. Defining a research problem. So a term problem means a question or an issue to be examined, okay? That's what I mean by a research problem. We don't mean it's an issue you're facing. It means it's an issue that you want to investigate. It's an area that is currently either misunderstood or an area that isn't well defined currently, okay? There's not enough research, there's not enough understanding of what's happening. The research problem refers to some difficulty or need with which a researcher experiences in the context of either a theoretical or a practical situation and wants to obtain a solution for the same. So basically what I just said. How do we know that we have a research problem? Well, if you're in an organizational setting, perhaps there's a lot of customer complaints. You know, customers are complaining about your products, complaining about your service, complaining about something. The need for you to research, understand what's going on. Why are they complaining? Perhaps you've overheard conversations between employees. You've heard people complaining. You've heard people saying, you know, things aren't working, things aren't going well. So again, that might be a reason for you to say, okay, well, why does the employee in that department or number of employees in marketing have this issue? We need to research. We need to find out what's really going on. Why are marketing feeling that way? The observations of inappropriate behavior. So again, perhaps you're actually observing that people are, or your staff are not doing things correctly. They're perhaps cutting corners. They're perhaps behaving in a particular way that isn't conducive with how the company wants their people to behave. Maybe there's a deviation from the business plan. Maybe the way in which your organization is performing is going away from what it was meant to do. Maybe the strategy you have in place is different to what you're actually seeing in practice. The strategy says this should happen, but what you're seeing happen in practice is very, very different. Again, you need to bring someone in to do some research to understand why. Again, a couple more examples there. These are all reasons why we may have a research problem. The first step in the research process, as I said already, is defining the problem. And that involves two activities. Firstly, identification and selection of the problem. Then secondly, the formulation of that problem. So for identification, it's about identifying a few problems and then selecting of one. Okay, so it's not about saying, here's all the problems, let's try and tackle them all at once. No, it's about saying, here's all the problems, this is the one, or these are the ones that are perhaps the most important. I'm going to focus on this one. Okay, and you would do that through what's called an evaluation activity. You would look at what's important. Why do you want to investigate it? Particularly in academia, you want to do something you're interested in. Don't investigate something you don't care about because you'll hate it. Okay, there's no point in doing a research in an area that you know nothing of, that you're not interested in, that you don't really know how it works, because it'll just make your life more difficult. Do something you're interested in, do something you want to learn more about, do something that you may actually enjoy understanding. How do you come up with your problems? Well, firstly, there's literature review, so readings. Okay, do readings, see what people are saying about the area, see what people have experienced, what their problems. Read, and read quite widely. Okay, look at academic research, look at trade journals, look at different areas. Academic experiences. So again, perhaps you've experienced something in one of your modules, or you've come across something, one of your lecturers has been discussing a particular field or a particular area of their practice, and you want to learn more about it, or you want to challenge some of that thinking. So that can be your academic experience. Perhaps it's your daily experience. Perhaps you work for an organization and you've observed things going wrong, or you observe things not working properly, and you want to research it, you want to understand why that's happening. That's your daily experience. Perhaps it's because of consultations. So again, this is where perhaps you've overheard, or the people have come to you to report a problem. You want to then say, okay, well, I want to get to the bottom of this problem. I want to research what's going on. There's a question that's just come through in the chat. Sorry, I've just seen that come through now. Yes, that's a good question. Thank you for sharing that, Romano. Yeah, absolutely. It could be absolutely anything. So human resources, for example, yeah. In companies that lack HR development or focusing on technology, yeah, absolutely. So these are all valid questions, and there are some organizations today that are facing that challenge. Perhaps they're not mature enough. Perhaps they don't have the resources. Perhaps they don't have the capabilities to be able to bring in a mature HR service, or to bring in technology, or to refresh their technology to cope with the demands of 21st century customers. So yeah, these are all very, very valid things, and these are things that you might want to research as part of your approach. So how do you select then from the research problems? Well, the selection of one appropriate researchable problem out of identified problem requires evaluation, okay? So we use a couple of criteria that can be useful in guiding us. We have internal or personal criteria, which is all about the researcher's own interests. As I said to you, do something you're interested in, not only because you want to learn more, but also because there'll be times in the research process where you'll feel like giving up, okay? So you have a lot of data, you have a lot of information, and you'll try to make sense of it, and sometimes it just feels like you can't make sense of it, okay? It just feels like you're drowning in lots of information and there's no way out. When that happens, you want to be drowning in information about a subject you like. The last thing you want to do is be drowning in information about something you couldn't care less about, you're not interested in, because it'll just give you more motivation to quit rather than continue. Okay, it'll make you demotivated, it'll make you feel like, what's the point? So my both professional and personal opinion to you is to investigate something that you're interested in. That way you'll be able to A, enjoy the experience, and B, you'll actually learn something that you care about. Other things can be stuff like external criteria or factors. So these are things such as, how important is it right now? So for example, most universities, they've got a research agenda, there'll be things that people were doing. As soon as COVID happened, every single university that I know of started saying, okay, drop everything else. We need to do research on COVID. We need to do research on how can we cure COVID. We need to do research on how the impact of COVID will be felt in business, how it'll be felt in the socio-economic. So everything came to a standstill. The focus completely shifted to, okay, COVID is happening. What can we do? How can we contribute to that discussion? It's about defining or formulating a research problem. So formulation is the process of refining the research, and formulation means translating and transforming the selected research problem into a scientifically researchable question, okay? So it's about taking the problem area, what you wanted to kind of understand, and turn it into a research question, turn it into something that can be researched. It needs to be specific, it needs to have a narrow scope or focus, and it needs to really be drawn into a particular element, drawn into a particular ideology, drawn into a particular perspective. Problem definition or problem statement needs to be clear and precise. Okay, so again, if you come up with a vague problem statement, or you come up with a vague thing that you're investigating, then what's the point? It needs to be clear and concise. Okay, I need to be able to see what you're investigating and understand that area. If you come out with a very vague statement, then I don't really know what you're doing. Okay, you need to be able to make it clear to me exactly what it is you're investigating. If you're investigating poverty, well, what kind of poverty? You're looking at wealth poverty, you're looking at food poverty, you're looking at education poverty. These are all things that are valid in today's society. There's different types of poverty, there's different types of issues that might be affecting governments, different types of issues that are affecting companies. So technology isn't an issue. A specific focus within technology is an issue. What type of technology? Is it an enterprise resource system? Is it customer relations system? Is it perhaps legacy technology? Maybe your machines are all old, maybe your infrastructures. So again, be specific, okay? Give me what it is you're doing. Technology is too broad. Technology can be anything. Technology can be anything from the keyboard that you use all the way up to the mainframe infrastructure and the server that hosts all of your capabilities and hosts all of your customer data. Okay, so technology is a big, big word. Deconstruct it for me. Tell me what it is you're focusing on. Why is technology important? What part of technology are you looking to investigate in relation to your research? There are two ways of stating a problem. You start by either posting questions always start by making a declarative statement. If you're posting questions, you're creating a research problem, okay? What you're doing is you're saying, how can something happen? Why does something happen? What does this mean? These are types of questions you're asking: who, why, where, not where perhaps, who, why, and what are probably more relevant, okay? And how as well. These are types of questions you want to be asking. However, you also have what's called making declarative statements. Now, declarative statements are all about declaring. It's about making hypotheses. It's about saying, I believe this will impact, this influences this in this way. So it's about saying whether or not something happens. It's about making a hypothesis. It's about making a claim. And the process involved in defining the problem is all about creating a statement, okay? It's about creating a statement that generalizes the problem. So it's about saying, here is my problem statement, here is what I'm going to be. Basically, when I'm reading your problem statement, it should read out to me what it is you're trying to achieve, okay? You need to be able to understand the nature of the problem. So it's about understanding what is actually going on underneath the surface. When you scratch beneath the surface, what are you actually going to be uncovering? And one way for you to be able to do that effectively is by surveying the available research. It's about carrying out a systematic literature review to understand what's actually happening. It's about developing ideas through discussions. So talk to people that are particularly knowledgeable or experts in that area and get their views. It's about rephrasing the research problem. So again, you had a broad research problem. To get down to your problem statement or your research problem, you need to be able to really understand how can you go from the broad to the specific. What do you want to keep? Where can you focus your attention within that problem area? A couple of criteria of a good research problem are, well, firstly, and I've said this about 10 times today, it's clear and unambiguous. I should be able to read it and understand exactly what research problem you're investigating because it's clear and easy to follow and understand. Okay, it's specific, it's focused. It needs to be empirical. So unfortunately, this isn't a conceptual study you're doing. You're doing an empirical research. Okay, you need to have some kind of data collection, either primary or secondary, as part of your research. Your research needs to be verifiable. So again, it's not something that you've just made up. You've not just sat at home and made up the numbers or made up the responses. You need to prove to me where you got it from. Who did you interview? Who did you speak to? When did you do that? So it's verifiable. Okay, to verify what you did, you need to have some kind of paper trail, some kind of audit that demonstrates how you got to your answer. It needs to be interesting. So what you're saying, what you're doing, it actually needs to have some kind of, fundamental purpose. It needs to be something that, says or does something to change my thinking, or say it does something to demonstrate that what's already out there isn't true, or is perhaps inaccurate, or is perhaps not a full picture. It needs to be novel and original. So again, you can't just copy what someone else has done and claim it to be your own. That's not what research is. Research is about you doing something in a different way, using different tools, using different techniques to try and see what the impact is. And finally, the availability of guidance. Who you have guiding you, who you have helping you, can make a big influence on the quality of your research. If you have someone guiding you who's never done research before in their life, chances are they're not much help. If you've got someone guiding you who's got a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, a lot of personal, perhaps, experience of conducting research, then he or she is more likely to give you advice that will stand you in good stead. So how do we get to where we want to be in research? Well, we've got to define the problem to get results and clear-cut research objectives. So what we do is we have what's called symptom detection. We detect what symptoms, what the issues. We have to analyze the situation. But most importantly, we have to define the problem, okay? Once you've analyzed, it's all about defining the problem. Unless you've done that step, you can't move into having a statement of research objectives. Your research won't have any objectives. Your research won't have a purpose unless you have a clearly defined problem, and that's your research question, okay? The research question you come up with is the definition of your problem. It's a statement, it's your research statement, it's what you want to do, it's what you want to achieve. And with that, I'm going to end today's lecture. Stop the share. So thank you very much to everyone for attending today. I know that was quite heavy with a lot of what I would call back-end, perhaps, perspectives on what theory underpins the research process. So we talked a little bit around why research is important, how research is operationalized. I gave you a research process model, and we started understanding the first step, which is the research problem, how you define the research problem. On Friday, we'll move that forward. We're going to look at how do you then go about operationalizing your research? How do you go from having a research question to designing your study, to carrying out your data collection, and to trying to analyze and come up with solutions. Okay, great. If there are no more questions, I will end the call. So if anyone does have any questions, please do come off mute and feel free to ask. Otherwise, I will see you all on Friday. Thank you for your attendance today.